Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 6th week of 2016. I'm Carl Estabrook. For 25 years, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, but I was deplatformed there. Deplatforming is a recent coinage in the university and media. It means depriving someone of a place to speak because of what they're saying. I appreciate the chance to come to you now via Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green, Ron Szoke, and I will try to say some true things. It's February 12th. On this day in the year 1968, the Phong Nai and Phong Not massacres occurred in Vietnam. It was a massacre conducted by the 2nd Marine Brigade of the South Korean Marines. They killed some 70 unarmed civilians in these two villages in South Vietnam. We forget sometimes that the war in Vietnam was conducted by the United States primarily against South Vietnam because South Vietnam as a country was not willing to take the government that we had picked out for them, and they resisted it. And it was to destroy that resistance that the U.S. Went into Vietnam in the Kennedy administration with everything from carpet bombing to the massive eventual commitment of troops of a drafty army. When the My Lai massacre was exposed in the fall of 1969, the massacre had occurred over a year earlier, there was great shock in the U.S. about the fact that American soldiers gang raped women in a Vietnamese village. These were not competing soldiers. This was a peasant village, and that they murdered children at the same time. And of course, there was great shock and horror when the reporter Seymour Hersh revealed what had happened in the village of My Lai. But of course, the American accounts, while admitting, finally, they weren't able to do anything else, that the outrage had occurred, that hundreds of people had been killed and women raped, babies murdered in My Lai. It was, of course, a remarkable departure from the way in which the war was being conducted. What we didn't learn until many years later was that it was the way the war was conducted, and that it was conducted that way not only by American soldiers but by our, quote, allies, close quote, that the U.S. had simply bought and brought to South Vietnam, such as the South Korean soldiers. When the South Korean massacres that occurred on this day in 1968, before the My Lai massacre, was revealed, of course, that was explained as aberrations of these vicious Orientals. These were Koreans, after all, who were conducting this, not Americans. Well, the problem with all of that, and the explanations continued in that vein for a long, long time. The problem with that is that the massacres, such as that at My Lai, was the way in which the U.S. conducted the war in South Vietnam. And it's taken many years for us to admit just how true that was. The important book by Nick Turse that came out 2 years ago, Kill Anything That Moves, The Real American War in Vietnam, gave an account after all these years of the atrocities that were the standard operating procedure of American forces in South Vietnam. In fact, it was the atrocities that they were so horrible that finally produced the revolt of the American conscript army that brought the American participation in the war to an end. The U.S. government found that it could not continue to fight a war in this fashion, that is, to destroy civilians in the way that the massacres did, with the connivance of a conscript army. That leads people today to say that we're making a mistake in not taking the notion of a draft seriously because the tendency of an army of draftees to be, in fact, more critical of what it's being sent to do exceeds that of a professional army. So it's said. It seems to me the argument is open. Nick Turse's work is important. It's important for us to realize what the United States does, how the United States has fought wars, and by the horrific way in which the South Vietnamese invasion was conducted by the United States can be paralleled to the Philippine insurrection at the beginning of the century, at the end of the last century. And indeed, it's no accident that in Vietnam, the areas controlled by forces hostile to the United States Army, the United States Expeditionary Force, were known as Indian country. There's a tradition here that unfortunately the U.S. was following then and in a sense is today in Southwest Asia when we read about the activities of the American Special Forces. I recommend Nick Turse's book, Kill Anything That Moves, The Real American War in Vietnam. If you live through those years, it will be a very hard book to read, probably under any circumstances. He is coming out with a new book next month called Tomorrow's Battlefield, U.S. Proxy Wars and Secret Ops in Africa. In the last several years of America's wars in Southwest Asia, we've occasionally become aware of its lapsing over in Africa, but the extent of it, once again, is not known, and the remarkable work of Nick Turse is revealing what's actually going on there. Might even compare Turse's book with Andrew Coburn's recent book, Kill Chain, The Rise of the High-Tech Assassins, about how the U.S. conducts war today. So you're watching news from Neptune, a Dulce Bellum in Expertes edition. Dulce Bellum in Expertes was a classical phrase made better known by Erasmus of Rotterdam in the 16th century when he published a collection of classical tags with essays on the political application to today, or to the 16th century, that are still illuminating 5 centuries later. Dulce Bellum in Expertes means war is sweet to those who don't know it, who are unaware of it, who are not familiar with it. This is a point that, as I say, has a classical base and a 16th century reminiscence. And unfortunately, I'm afraid, as I listen to the presidential debates, it's very much, far too much applicable to today. So you're watching News from Neptune. Go to Bellum.
Which have really opened up a lot of conversation about things that I would not have expected to be going on in the presidential campaign at this time, and I think it has reverberations at the local level. Let me just promote a couple of events that are coming up in the next month or so. Representative Carol Ammons is having a meeting or a conversation at the Independent Media Center on Saturday, February 27th, and about a month from now, on February 12th, the Saturday, 4 weeks and a day from when we're recording this show, the Green Party, as well as some of the Democrats who are supporting Bernie Sanders, is going to host a forum at the Champaign Public Library called, with the topic being, "What is Socialism?" And I think that this comes from the discourse that has been raised in relation to the relative success so far of the Bernie Sanders campaign. So let me begin by saying the words like socialism and progressive are really not technical terms. They're not scientific terms. They're terms that are historically rooted. They're terms that are defined by conventions of various kinds, and so they're subject to debate. But nevertheless, it is important what we think we mean when we are using those terms. It's important to challenge the meanings of those when they become self-serving or ideological in the service of certain interests, especially class interests. I think when Carol Ammons, in her effort to promote some discourse about progressivism in politics, I think right at the start it's important to define what progressive has meant in the history of this country, what it means in the current context, and why other words, whether it be liberal or socialist or leftist or radical, are not being used to describe in the local context groups of people who collect around certain views and would like to influence the political process. And by the same token, when we conduct a forum in a month or so to address the topics of what is socialism, I don't want it to be an academic exercise. There has to be some historical grounding in what we believe by that word, but it's been a couple hundred years since people started trying to define what a socialist was in response to their awareness that capitalism was something that had to be challenged. Marx himself spent most of his time defining capitalism, and from what I understand, little or none of his time defining what is socialism. Nevertheless, we are left with an important project, I think, related to those of us on the left who want to be a positive influence on the Bernie Sanders campaign and who want to see something good come out of this, whatever the success of the Sanders campaign turns out to be. And I think that defining socialism, whether it can coexist with capitalism, whether it can't, and on what terms it can or can't do that, I think that's important for people on the left to grapple with in the context of seizing this moment of opportunity, a teachable moment, despite the cliched aspect of that term often used. This is a teachable moment, and also I think it's a very actionable moment in terms of where people who are fed up with establishment politics, who are fed up with capitalism, who want to use this moment to really define these terms and to move forward and to tactically provide some support and criticism to the Bernie Sanders campaign as it moves forward. These are all really difficult questions and difficult issues. They will change, tactics will change as the primary season moves forward, but I think it's important to be both positive and critical as we move forward into these weeks and months. Things may start to happen really fast in the next month or two. There may be a lot of things going down from the left perspective or even from the Bernie Sanders point of view, good or bad, but it's good to go into this with open eyes, with defining some terms, with seeing what the options are, and I would just sort of put that on the table in relation to what we want to talk about today.
Thank you, David. You're watching News from Neptune. We'll go to Ron Szoke. You got a response to David's opening, Ron?
Sure. This is increasingly of concern to me. These words are being thrown around now in political confrontations or what are sometimes miscalled debates, and it is very annoying because these terms are also loose, and I very much prefer to exclude these commonly used words like liberal and conservative from anything that I might want to say. They have only some use as initial guideposts to the general direction or area that one is talking about. But these words have mutated so much, they've been overused and abused so much that I have great difficulty with them. So yeah, that's actually one of the things I wanted to comment on today. What does conservative mean? Who's a conservative? The Republican presidential candidates are constantly saying that they're the true conservatives, and the other, their opposition is not conservative enough, or not a true conservative, or whatever. What does that mean? We have no conception, I think, of what a authentic conservative is, because we don't have any medieval tradition of a hereditary elite in this country, and those people being defended by the conservatives in their wealth and privileges, and but we seem to be acquiring one now, a hereditary elite of wealth, anyway, because of the elimination of the inheritance tax, or what's sometimes called the death tax, and so on. And we're getting plenty of warnings about that, but it seems to proceed anyway. What does progressive mean? Well, it means simply progress in some direction towards something, but you never have to say what. So.
Well, in the current context, I think the thing that most concerns me is that progressive has become a kind of weasel word for identity politics,
right.
And that it can mean more than that. But historically, it's been used as a substitute for a genuine reference to class politics, and that way we can avoid talking about something that isn't supposed to exist in this country, which is social classes. And you say that you refer to the fact that perhaps hereditary power, or an oligarchy, or a plutocracy, or however you want to label that, and those are important words to understand as well, and maybe the differences between those two words. That somehow that's something new, but I think that's something that goes back to our founding. We've had a capitalist class in this country since before we became a country, and things have gone along those lines as America has proceeded to become a global power. So that it's more important than ever, given. You can certainly refer to a time in recent memory of our lifetimes in which social class seemed to be a little more malleable than it is now. But the fact that this wealth has been accumulated in the manner which it has is nothing quite new. We've gone back about 1 century in terms of that. And so, again, those, from the left point of view, which I'm coming from, I think we can clarify. Liberal and conservative are complicated words, and again, it's a matter of convention, but I think convention can be informed by historical understanding of how those words have come to be used in a capitalist context in order for people on the left to escape the limits of that capitalist context.
Yeah. Well, capitalism itself has been mutating in the meantime, and I'm not sure it means now anything like what it meant, 200 years ago. But it's very complicated, because what we mean by conservatism now, on its economic side anyway, is what was called liberalism in the 19th century, and the whole thing has become so muddied up that I find it largely futile to talk about it. So people prefer to call themselves moderates or centrists, or to approve of that kind of thing today.
If I could muddy up things further, I think the term populist even needs to be used in ways that, again, are historically informed by what populism actually was at a time in this country when there was a party named after it. And that we can apply that to the left and the right in various ways. But I think when we look at things in terms of power, in terms of vested interest in the system the way it is, and in that aspect it means ownership of capital, the ownership of capital and the ownership of wealth, which a capital itself can be defined in various ways, and it's important we understand how Marx did define capital, which is different than the way Piketty defines capital in his recent book. But all these are, I think they're understandable and usable terminology with being historically informed on how they have been used and where they're going. And I think when we're clear about the nature of class politics, we can be clear about a lot of these other things as well. As well as about foreign policy and how that relates to that.
And I think it's probably important to make these distinctions and to begin talking about these terms, in part because we're seeing an alteration in the political forces in the United States right now of a sort that really hasn't happened for a while. I mean, we have two formal political parties, both of which seem to be undergoing a fissioning, not fishing, but fissioning. They're coming apart. And the possibility of the Conservative Party, as it has traditionally been understood, traditionally meaning in my lifetime, the Republican Party, coming apart into a populist wing behind Donald Trump, and a conventional wing, an establishment wing, perhaps represented by Marco Rubio or one of the other
was supposed to have
group.
been that was supposed to have been Jeb Bush's
Exactly,
forte.
that's right.
Yeah.
On the other hand, we have the Democratic Party, supposedly the Liberal Party, coming apart into Sanders and Clinton wings, and once again, I think it's right to suggest that what we're seeing here is a populist insurgency in both of these parties. The populist insurgency produces Donald Trump on the one side, and it produces Bernie Sanders on the other. So you have 4 people at the table, if you like, 4 parties at the table, 4 groups at the table, and it seems to me that there's a sense in which this is a healthy sign. This means that, in fact, we are having a discussion. We would not be having a discussion about the word socialism in American politics even 5 years ago. We are today, and this has got to be seen as a gain. What we're doing here is breaking through the carapace of American political discourse and opening up a discussion that should be taking place, a discussion about what the United States as a political society is doing and whose interests are being served. I think David is quite right in suggesting that the notion of identity politics should be, as opposed to class politics, should be seen as describing at least one of these divisions, the division in the Democratic Party. Whether that same distinction can be used to describe the division in the other party or not, I don't know. I'm not clear about what I want to argue on that right now, but it does seem to me that there's a great deal of difference between the sort of identity politics being pushed by the Clinton wing of the Democratic Party and the class politics, it can't be called anything else, being pushed by the Sanders wing. This is important. And like David, I find myself much more attracted to what the Sanders people are saying.
There are a number of political thinkers who view this as very dangerous. They've been talking about the supposed realignment of the parties for decades, maybe generations. And is it really a good thing to have ideologically purer parties? So a workers' party versus a whatever you want to call them, a party of the wealthy. Will that lead to social conflict that would be very unfortunate? And there are a number of political scientists, I believe, who used to take this position that it's better to have these parties overlapping a great deal. So there was talk then about moderate Republicans, remember that? Such as the late Chuck Percy and a few others we might name. But all the talk now has been about the increasing polarization of the two parties and any suggestion that the two might overlap in the person of someone who's a moderate for either side seems to be getting lost. And is it really a good thing to have sharply opposed ideology-based parties?
Well, but doesn't it tell
Certainly.
us? Doesn't it tell us something when the polarization is occurring, not really between the parties so much, but within each party?
Yeah. Exactly.
The polarization is, however you want to view people like someone like Donald Trump or even Ben Carson, the polarization is with people who are struggling, who are and who understand that the establishments of both parties serve the interests of the 1%.
Right.
And that they do it in slightly different ways, and that they do a kind of frickin' frack, nip and tuck kind of act that creates differences creates differences in the media and around certain issues that avoid fundamental issues of who controls the wealth and how government, which is not of, by, and for the people, is perpetuating their control of that wealth. So I just again we need to use these terms to dispel the notion that sure you can dispel the notion that Republican and Democrat means anything. They're just labels, or even liberal and conservative within a capitalist understanding of how it is you go about accumulating wealth under what terms. Okay, the Democrats like the idea that people of all races and genders are equally represented in the 1%. The Republicans may have a little more problem with that, although they would probably say that they wouldn't. But how else are you going to talk about it? How else are we going to talk about it except by using words that relate in somewhere in some their relation to what's real has to do with what the interests of the people are. And the interests of the establishments of both of these parties, we saw that clearly on Amy Goodman this morning with the leader of the Black Caucus in Congress supporting Hillary Clinton.
Right.
And the division between someone like that and who's called by people like Glenn Ford, or the Black Agenda Report, is called the Black Misleadership class. The increasingly transparent and just sort of pathetic manner in which these people defend Hillary Clinton's record, or the manner in which some people, feminist people who even call themselves socialist feminists, are increasingly struggling to say that, well, we need a woman in the White House. And even Carol Ammons a few weeks ago when she hosted Tammy Duckworth down here. Ron, you were there, I know, writing, saying to the journalist present, well, first of all, we need a woman in the U.S. Senate. Well, these are important issues that have to do ultimately with either confronting class issues or avoiding class issues.
Yeah. Well, for some time, economic orthodoxy, as represented, for example, in Samuelson's textbook, has been promoting what's called a mixed economy. And this, to me, means that capitalism has survived only to the extent that it's taken over certain aspects of socialism. And what it has led to is a supposed mixed economy, or in the terminology of some, there's something intermediate, which has been arising since the middle of the last century,
But
called managerialism, which is neither capitalism nor socialism.
But neoliberalism did away with that. I mean, neoliberalism said let's get rid. You know, we can use some of these aspects of Keynesianism or retain some of them, but by and large, neoliberalism has said no. The government is not going to act to make sure that demand is taken care of. That when people are out of work, that we will create demand, put money in people's pockets to put them back to work. Neoliberalism put a stop to all that. So again, all these things have to be understood historically. I mean, it's important that we understand all these things, but that there was, on the one hand, there was a big change in neoliberalism since 1980 or even before that. On the other hand, there was continuity in that under this Keynesian era from 1945 to 1980 or so, the capitalist class still had control, and they were able, when they were ready to come out of that, when they were ready to really push back against the working class, they did it, and they've been doing it for 35 or 40 years.
Yeah, the amalgamation you talk about, Ron, such as it is, and I think probably this is a place we do need to be a little more specific about what we mean when we talk about capitalism and socialism and so forth. But insofar as the amalgamation that you mentioned occurred, of course, the occasion for that was the New Deal, was the Great Depression, and the response to the Great Depression, when everyone realized in the American government that things could not go on as they had. Something else had to be done. And it's not entirely wrong to say that something that had to be done were the adoption of socialist style reform, so to speak. Great argument about how far that went and how important that was. But the important thing to see is that turnaround in the 1930s was itself turned around and reversed in the 1970s, as David just said. And we have two periods here, the New Deal period from the 1930s to the 1970s, and the neoliberal period since the 1970s, where those socialist reforms, such as they were consciously and purposely rolled back by both Republican and Democratic administrations. Now, it's what we're seeing played out in the Democratic Party right now is a reassertion of that New Deal tradition in the person of candidate Sanders, and the continuity of the neoliberal rejection of those reforms in the candidacy of Hillary Clinton. The language needs to be cleaned up, as you suggest. The language is purposely misleading on both sides. Mrs. Clinton is busily running around insisting that she's a progressive right now because she wants to avoid the growing awareness of the fundamental distinction between the sorts of things, the class politics that Sanders is talking about, and the identity politics that she's representing. And the interesting point here is that the representatives of neoliberalism in both parties are on the defensive. That may be finally the most important aspect of this election, and it's being recognized on various sides, including even, as we mentioned, by Charles Krauthammer in the Morning News Gazette. So, yeah, strange things are happening.
Let me introduce another complication then. In the recent Nation Gar Alperovitz, or however you say that.
Alperovitz, I'm told,
Alperovitz,
by
okay.
people who know him.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm saying that.
Saying that socialism in America is closer than you think. Experiments with public ownership are thriving across the country. The challenge is to link them and to scale them up. Other people are complaining that what is being called socialism is nowhere near the real item, that these little things like cooperatives, of which we have a couple of good examples locally,
Yes.
and employee ownership and so on, do they deserve to be called socialism?
Well, this is what Alperovitz is arguing. He's saying that socialism is coming from the bottom up, not from the top down. And what we have is in the crisis of American capitalism, of neoliberalism, the fight back against it is coming from, as you say, cooperatives, workers' control, local community involvement. So we remember that's what happened in Spain before the Second World War. That's what the Spanish Civil War was about.
Oh,
so,
yeah, that's good. Local currencies, apparently the local one here in Champaign-Urbana is not going very far. Heard anything about it recently, have you?
But yeah, and it's something I don't know enough about is this the Bitcoin business. There are people who want to suggest that the alternative currencies that are turning up in places like Bitcoin are adaptable to this ground-up socialism that you're describing. Now, I haven't heard the connection or seen the connection made very clearly, but the idea that there's a possibility of that, particularly as the worldwide capitalist economic news gets worse and worse, becomes interesting, eh?
What we're hearing more and more about buying local, especially with respect to food, but other items too. Apparently there's a local group now encouraging all business people to buy from other local business people. And so
But
I don't know if that'll get anywhere.
The problematic questions, I think, have to do with how much, as important as it is that local people organize at the grassroots level, that positive change can really only come from the grassroots level. The question is what the ambitions of those local movements are at the state and national level, because without some fundamental systemic changes, these are just going to be small movements that are going to end up being overwhelmed by the power which capital controls the choices that people have. So it's very complicated, but I would refer people. You mentioned Gar Alperovitz, who has been at this for quite a long time and has developed some good ideas. I think it's called the New Commonwealth or something like that. He's got a couple of websites he's been involved with, and it's great that people have ideas about how to begin to what. There's another important thinker who I think is one of the bases that I've referred to in terms of the people speaking to the question of what is socialism. That is a fellow named Eric Olin Wright up in Madison, who talks about how to deal with capitalism. He talks about what the options are we have in terms of what he calls taming capitalism, or what he calls eroding capitalism. And these are just various ways in which we either have to regulate the way capitalism works, especially finance capitalism, in the destructive manner in which we've seen that it can work, as well as expand those areas of life in which exchange value, what Marx called exchange value, is less important or not important at all, and what he called use value is dominant, because ultimately it's use values that determine the quality of our lives. And so there are areas in which we can take. There are socialized areas or socialized. You can socialize institutions in certain ways, which takes the market aspect out of them, whereas the neoliberals keep wanting to put the market aspect. Most obviously, say public education, where we were used so long to thinking of this as an area in which capitalism couldn't intrude on quite the same way it could intrude on other areas. But now they've seen that, the neoliberal capitalists have seen that as an area for making profit, and we have to push back against that, not just because of test scores or teacher salaries or anything like that, because we need areas in which people can be free to operate outside the sort of market nexus and to be more fully human because of that, because of the lack of a profit motive.
That seems to be the crux often is private ownership and who's going to profit from these things. Yeah.
Exactly. That puts it into the bailiwick of traditional capitalism completely.
Yeah.
Our investment decision is going to be made by the owners, a group of or their representatives, or are they going to be made democratically? I mean, if we want to get theoretical about the notion of socialism, the idea that socialism is an economic system that produces for use, not for profit, and it produces for use under democratic conditions.
Absolutely.
Socialism is democratic or it doesn't exist at all. There are problems with that because, of course, the primary use of the term socialism in the 20th century was for a non-democratic system, and therefore a contradiction in terms in the understanding of traditional socialism. Well, the nice thing about the disappearance of the Soviet Union may be that we can talk about socialism again, and that does indeed seem to be what's happening in the American presidential election this year, to my, I must say, great surprise.
Yeah. Well, does socialism mean the elimination of all private property?
Well, you can keep your toothbrush, Ron. That's not what we're worried about.
Yeah.
We're talking about private property. We're talking about productive property.
Yeah.
Productive property
Right.
is property that we need in order to produce food, clothing, and shelter. Now, we have a system in which productive property is said to be the private possession of a small group of people whom we call, by the technical term, owners. Socialism begins with the notion is that productive property must be owned, that is, administered, directed by all of us, and it must be done democratically. And that's the theoretical distinction at the beginning of the description of capitalism and socialism.
This looseness led to this big scare in the early days of Bolshevism about did it require socializing your spouse and
As I say, without putting too fine a point on it, you can keep your toothbrush, Ron. When we introduce socialism, as we must. You're watching News from Neptune. I want to turn to some questions about war and foreign policy, but the topic that's underway here is far too important to be put aside easily. So we'll put it aside with some difficulty, unless you want to comment.
just another
Closing comment?
complication, I'm sorry, is that what you're talking about requires people being aware of their class interests. And it's become notorious and a matter of much discussion about the extent to which people simply, in this country recently, simply do not vote on the basis of what appears to be their class interest. They're so confused by other things, that symbolic issues, social issues, and so on.
It's the other things that are important. I mean, about the beginning of the 20th century, the leading capitalist states found that they could no longer simply use the police to maintain their political rule, that they needed something more than that. They needed the consent of the governed to some extent, and therefore that had to be constructed with a great deal of effort. And we produced these amazing propaganda systems of the 20th century that did precisely that. Now that is significant, and the only way that we're going to produce a serious critique of capitalist society is by breaking through that immense propaganda system. That's indeed, hey, that's why we're here, right?
Let me just conclude this segment for my part by saying that the people haven't been given the choice in the quote-unquote two-party system to choose their interest. The working classes haven't had the opportunity of choosing their interests in that context, because neither class ultimately has represented the interest of labor, of the interest of those who really want to benefit and control the nature of their own labor and who benefits from that. And again, we have at the local level, I'll just summarize, we do have another party called the Green Party that does represent class interests pretty straightforwardly. And in between the two events I mentioned at the start of this program, the Carol Ammons event on February 27th at the Independent Media Center at 4, and the Green Party event at the Champaign Public Library on March 12th at Saturday at 1. In between then, we, I think, may quite possibly have a visit from Jill Stein, the candidate, the presidential candidate for the Green Party, on March 3rd or 4th during the week. That's being arranged right now, and hopefully some of you will have an opportunity to meet her. And I'm sure there will be very many interesting things to say about the relationship of the Green Party, both locally and statewide and nationally, in relation to what is to become of the Sanders campaign and what our reaction from those on the left is to be to the Sanders campaign in relation to its possible success or possible failure. These are things we're going to have to be very open-minded and quick on our feet about as we move forward.
I'd like to get your views, gentlemen, on two notes here. First, the U.S. and Russia have forged a plan to implement a ceasefire among combatants in Syria and to begin the delivery of much-needed humanitarian aid to besieged Syrian civilians who've been caught in the middle of fighting between the government and a host of rebel groups. The Islamic State and the Nusra Front are excluded from the ceasefire, meaning Russian planes and aircraft from the U.S.-led coalition will continue to target them. The aid deliveries may begin within the next several days, while the shooting should stop by late next week, if the agreement holds, according to negotiators. This is quite remarkable. This is an agreement settled in a meeting in Munich this week between the American Secretary of State and the Russian Foreign Minister, others involved as well. This is a bit surprising, but it seems to me that it's quite understandable if we step out of the fantasy world of American foreign policy discussion and look at what the U.S. government is actually doing and has been doing all along in regard to the Middle East. But you won't get that from our presidential candidates. In the discussion the other night, I was struck by Mrs. Clinton's obvious lies about Iran. And in order to make it clear, I will simply quote, yeah, this is Mrs. Clinton on Iran. Yes, they, she means the Iranian government, they have to stop being the main state sponsor of terrorism. Yes, they have to stop trying to destabilize the Middle East, causing even more chaos. Yes, they've got to get out of Syria. They've got to quit sponsoring Hezbollah and Hamas. They've got to quit trying to ship rockets into Gaza that can be used against Israel. We have a lot of work to do with Iran before we ever say that they could move towards normalized relations with us. That's just incredill.
Yeah, I heard that last night. I wondered,
yeah,
where's she getting it?
Well, where she getting it is from the absolutely poisoned discourse in America on foreign policy, it's quite remarkable. I have never had any particular brief for this president, but when we see that the American government is busily trying to reconstruct the overall structure of order, as Henry Kissinger, who was evoked the other night too, called it, in terms of its control of Middle East energy resources, the attacks on it by neocons like Clinton and some of the Republicans, not all the Republicans, interestingly enough, make it a fantasy world. I mean, it's so far from an accurate description of what's going on and of what the United States is doing and what serious criticisms of American policy might be that, it's very hard to make any sense of it at all. And of course, that's the point. Americans are not supposed to make sense of the imperial operations the U.S. is carrying on in the Middle East. Comments on the situation?
Yeah, there's a glimmer of hope in this supposed agreement between the Russians and Kerry.
Astonishing, yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
In Syria, the problem now seems to be that the Russians don't want to start until March 1st, and Kerry and others are accusing them of wanting to do a lot of bombing in the meantime.
The agreement is due to the ceasefire is due to come into being in a week,
Yeah.
but it's a it is not specifically not to include the Al Qaeda and Islamic State elements in the in Syria.
Yeah. A couple of other scraps here. The Supreme Court just blocked Obama's climate regulation. Are we screwed? This says. It depends on who the next president is. This was also in the Nation, and that was really a bad move, it seems to me. On the other hand, Obama bans solitary confinement for juveniles in federal prison, and he made a visit to a mosque in Baltimore, and has got a lot of heavy criticism for that, but these look like favorable omens in some respects.
In relation to the foreign policy issue, that's going to be, of course, the toughest nut to crack, sort of ideologically,
Right.
in terms of the discourse in terms of the Sanders campaign making any genuine breakthroughs, if that's what you want to call it,
Yeah.
in relation to truthfulness and in relation to helping people to understand what the relation of their discontent at a domestic and economic level is to what's going on in foreign policy. And of course, the establishment will always use foreign policy, will always use the assumed American exceptionalism and the assumed jingoism and the assumed support our troops mentality to kind of repress, to change the nature of the discourse. And Hillary Clinton is doing that, but interestingly, in this kind of, I didn't hear the debate last night, so I hadn't heard that quote before, but interestingly, she's doing that in a kind of ham-handed, pathetic kind of way that should be transparent to even people who are not highly critical of U.S. foreign policy. I mean, since when has Iran been supporting Hamas to any effect?
Yes, exactly.
For years, for a decade or two, even if it ever did, which you know, there's probably never any real evidence that they did in terms of any weaponry. The Hamas was cut off from their weaponry when Egypt was closed off to them. Ironically, when the Mubarak government was overthrown. So. I don't know. Clinton seems desperate to me, and let's hope that she'll continue to get more desperate and say more silly things, and that the Clintons, as has been done, recent books. There's two being advertised on Counterpunch and so forth by both Doug Henwood and Diana Johnstone, have really laid Hillary Clinton's record out there. And you know, she can run, but she can't hide. I mean, she was. You know, it's not sexist to associate her with her husband's record. She was there supporting her husband. Okay, that's don't get away with that. Don't try to get away with that. That's my husband. I'm not accountable for him. Well, maybe not in some ways, but for goodness sakes.
I think the point that's being lost here, and it's not an accident, is that U.S. war-making around the world continues, and it continues on an absolutely massive fashion that the Obama administration has managed to hide from most Americans, and produce these aimless discussions about whether we're doing enough to fight terrorism or not. The Obama administration is conducting a worldwide program of drone assassinations, in addition to attacking 8 countries around the world, 2 more than George Bush. And that program of drone assassinations has killed literally thousands of people, including American citizens and hundreds of children, and it continues today. And it's been called, quite accurately, the most extreme terrorist campaign in modern times. So if terrorism is the problem, then we know where to go to look for the perpetrators of terrorism. But there's a good deal more to the war that the U.S. is carrying on that is not being discussed, even by the dissident factions in the Republicans and Democratic parties. Most Americans are not aware that President Obama has just sent more ground troops to Syria and to Iraq. The recent U.S. deployment of Special Operation Forces to Syria expands a global U.S. battlefield that is at a historic size. This year, Special Operation Forces, American death squads, have been sent to a record 147 countries, 3/4 of the nations on the planet. It's a 145% increase from the days of George Bush. Now, that's the war that we should be talking about, the war that actually is being conducted by the Obama administration, and we're not. It's not part of the discussion at all.
Well, I prefer to reserve my comments along those lines till the Monday or Tuesday show. But 3 quick points before we stop. Look for Aware tomorrow morning, Saturday morning.
Yes.
The 13th at the Middle Market in Lincoln Square in Urbana, if you'd like to come and discuss some of these issues or pick up a calendar or whatever. And let's see, what were the other points? The Michael Moore film.
Yes.
Who do we, or where do we invade next?
That sounds
is coming
important.
to Savoy, and it's been getting some good reviews, and so it may be worth seeing. Some people are saying it's the best thing he's done. Finally, my little mascot here, Ziggy, is a toy for today, and this is anticipation of Valentine's Day. So if anyone would like to have this thing, I'll give it away to the first person who contacts me. And,
in fact, they have to take it, right?
Yeah, right. And Ziggy, the little flasher here. So you open this up and it says, "I love you."
Oh, my.
And so if you want to give that to someone for Valentine's Day, that's great.
Ron, as usual, finds a way to raise the tone around here.
Right.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 6th week of 2016. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and Ron Szoke. Our thanks to our directors and producers, Jason and Yosef. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4 p.m. with Neptuner David Johnson, and more news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, that you can't hear elsewhere in CU. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.